Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this exciting webinar on applying trade facilitation concepts to imports and exports. My name is Ron Olasco and I will be your moderator for today's session. We are thrilled to have you here. Before we begin, let's go over for a few housekeeping items to ensure a smooth experience for everyone. For audio and video, can you please confirm if you can hear me, and if you can see the slides? Please type in yes in the chat box. Perfect. Thank you, Diana. I hope everyone can hear the audio. Thank you so much. For Q&A, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A section. We will address them during the Q&A segment at the end. Feel free to engage in the chat box, but please keep it professional and relevant to the topic. This session is being recorded and a replay will be uploaded to ITC YouTube channel. If you experience any issue, please feel free to type in the chat box and I will definitely help you out. It's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed speaker, Anthony Cambas, Statewide Manager of International Trade University of Mississippi, MS Small Business Development Center Network. We're honored to have him with us today, sharing their insight or his insight on AI applying facilitation concept of import and export. Applying trade facilitation concepts to import and export. This webinar will help you develop a clear understanding of the key success of trade facilitation, laws, and regulation, including international agreements and national frameworks. Drawing from real-world professional experience, we'll explore how trade facilitation concept can be applied to streamline both export and import processes, improving compliance, reducing delays, and enhancing overall efficiency in cross-trade border. Without any further ado, let's welcome our speaker for today, Anthony Cambas. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Ron. And just to confirm again, you can hear me okay? And you can see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. So if anything, as everyone knows, technology doesn't always work perfectly. So if we encounter any bumps along the road, we're going to shift gears and make it all work as smoothly as possible. So thank you, Ron, for the invitation and all the hard work you and your team have done to put this talk together. So when I was first asked to talk about this topic, trade facilitation, that was, I think, in late 2024, or definitely before the new administration in the U.S. Came in to the office. So as I like to do, I always like to make whatever work I'm doing, whatever talk I'm doing, as relevant to a current context as possible. So obviously, a lot of things have changed in international trade. A lot of things have changed around the concept of quote unquote trade facilitation. So the approach I'm taking today will be different than it would have been if I would have done this in late 2024. And what I want to do here is kind of marry concepts or bring together concepts around trade facilitation and how they are relevant in the real world, so to speak, of applied international trade. And so to do this, I'm going to talk some about my career in international trade and how the issue of trade facilitation intersected with that career, and bring in some of my own insights. A lot of the current work that I do these days, I'm part of what's called the Small Business Development Center Network in Mississippi. And this is a national program, by the way. So across the United States, there are small business development centers. My area focuses international trade. So on a day-to-day basis, I'm working with small, medium enterprises in the US and entrepreneurs who are trying to navigate all that's going on in trade. And so trade facilitation is a key concept of that. And I'm going to explain how I weave that into my work. And so I'm moving on to the next. Can you see it okay? It might not line up perfectly, everyone. Ron, can you see that okay?
Yes, we can see it okay.
Okay. So at any time, just tell me if there's some issue. So a little bit about my background in international trade. I started in the late 1980s, originally from Florida. So back in Miami in the late 1980s, me and some friends of mine who were originally from Central America, we started exporting, if anyone remembers, fax machines back to Central America. So the concept of trade facilitation as such, and that term, if it existed, I didn't know about it. I was an entrepreneur, and I remember getting down to the airport and trying to do the paperwork, and it was paperwork in those days, not so electronic. And people at the airlines were asking me questions. I had no idea what they meant. We need, what's your ECCN number, et cetera, et cetera. And because the concept of trade facilitation and making information available, especially online, um, I didn't know those answers originally. And then I started looking for sources. There were printed materials out there. It took me time. But in order were and comply with them. So just giving a little of that background, that was the late 1980s. So I've been working in international trade in various areas uh, since the late 80s. And um, my career has taken me into different areas of international trade, all of them impacted by trade facilitation, including I worked with U.S. Customs in Miami, Florida in the 90s, and issues having to do with regulating trade were very big. And at some point, after the NAFTA free trade agreement, which has since been replaced by the USMCA, came into effect in the 1990s, and I'm going to talk more about this, there was a key part of the NAFTA implementation legislation that mandated that customs make information available to businesses to comply. We called it the MOD Act. So it was called shared responsibility. Customs had to make information available to the trade community, and then the trade community had the responsibility to seek out that information and comply. So it wasn't so much the internet in those days, but you could get access to information in print form or meet with customs and other government agencies. So in my career, as I said, I was an import specialist team leader. In Miami, we enforced harmonized classification, valuation, tariffs, trade policy, all the stuff you hear in the news these days, as well as intellectual property. And after I left U.S. Customs, so I worked about 7 to 8 years with U.S. Customs, became a team leader, and then I went to work on international projects, donor funded and other types of international projects to implement customs and trade modernization, and in some cases export development in about 20 countries, I would say, in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So when I look at trade facilitation, I'm also looking through this lens. And I also was involved through that time period in some projects that specifically focused on trade facilitation. And so my international and U.S. experience around customs and trade facilitation and enforcement, which is back in the highlight as a highlight these days, they inform my approach and understanding of this issue. I'm also a licensed customs broker in the United States. And so a customs broker, I'm sure we have people from around the world, but in the United States, the customs broker exam is deemed to be one of the most difficult professional exams in existence. Even more so, the passing rates are traditionally lower than the CPA, which is for accountants. So I have that credential, and certified customs specialist, which is through the National Customs Brokers and Forward Association of America. And to me, that's very relevant because that's the association that works with trade practitioners. And something, if anyone's interested later, you can contact me about the Certified Global Business Professional, or CGBP, which is through an organization called NASBITE, but it takes a broad approach to trade. So not talking about me per se here, but kind of explaining when I talk about these issues, what type of lens I'm doing this through. So I'm going to go on to the next one. So what is trade facilitation? There's no one definition for trade facilitation. I'm just going to share a couple with you. The OECD refers to trade facilitation as a specific set of measures that streamline and simplify technical and legal procedures for products entering or leaving a country to be traded internationally. So when we talked about imports and exports, there it says entering or leaving a country. Trade facilitation covers the full spectrum of border procedures, from electronic exchange of data about a shipment to the simplification and harmonization of trade documents, to the possibility to appeal administrative decisions to border agencies. So we're going to see a lot of these elements when we look later at the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement. And so there's no one single source or definition. And in the end, I would say the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement even builds on, I mentioned earlier, the NAFTA implementation legislation in the US on the idea of shared responsibility and what we call informed compliance. Um, so, World Trade Organization is referring to trade facilitation as, or here's a commentary on it. Bureaucratic delays and red tape pose a burden for moving goods across borders for traders. Trade facilitation, and I highlighted this part, the simplification, modernization, and harmonization of export and import processes has therefore emerged as an important issue for the world trading system. So the emphasis, once again, on harmonization, modernization, and making things more agile. And finally, I think this is the last definition because these are some of the key players in international trade, especially the WTO and the World Customs Organization, or WCO, refers to trade facilitation in the WCO context. In other words, the context of customs administrations means the avoidance of unnecessary trade restrictiveness. This can be achieved by applying modern techniques and technologies while improving the quality of controls in an internationally harmonized manner. Harmonization, again, is mentioned. So the issue of trade facilitation goes beyond those definitions. It goes beyond, specifically, I'm going to focus some on the World Trade Organization Trade Facilitation Agreement, which was an agreement that brought all the WTO members into the realm formally of needing to apply trade facilitation measures. But trade facilitation goes beyond that, and I'm going to say from my own career over 35 years that it predates the WTO TFA. And when I was working on some international projects around the world in this area, I found that some of the countries that I was working in, it was, if not a novel or a new concept, it wasn't really understood to be building on previous initiatives around trade facilitation. And trade facilitation was never a single undertaking. It has been done through national customs laws, regulations, and policies. GATT 1947 and 1994, I'm going to argue the predecessor had a lot of elements in it that, sorry, I got a little friend there bothering me, that were talking about trade facilitation. You also had the International Convention on the Simplification and Harmonization of Customs Procedures, the Kyoto Convention, which later turned into the Revised Kyoto Convention back in 1999 and entered in force in 2006. So once again, that's through the World Customs Organization or customs administrations, and in various free trade agreements. Of course, I'm from the United States, so I'm going to talk about agreements that the United States entered into, such as DR-CAFTA, which I personally was involved on the ground in Central America helping to implement, and that included the Central American countries minus Panama, which is a different, it's not considered part of Central America for the integration of Central America customs and trade regulations. And Dominican Republic was added, which is a Caribbean island nation. And also national trade facilitation committees. They've taken on a formal name since the WTO TFA came into existence. But in my experience working around the world in customs and providing technical assistance to customs administrations since the early to mid 2000s, the concept of trade facilitation committees or organizations that brought together the public and private sector around trade facilitation did not spring up into existence only when the WTO TFA came into effect. And an organization called the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation, which is part of the World Economic Forum, is working a lot on this issue of trade facilitation. And to make this a relevant and up-to-date presentation, hopefully, I found a post on LinkedIn just a few days ago talking about trade facilitation from the organization that I just talked about. So why trade facilitation matters more than ever. So, and we could think of this as something that heavily impacts companies of all sizes, but especially entrepreneurs and SMEs. So why trade facilitation matters more than ever. Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation just posted this. Bureaucratic bottlenecks, outdated regulations, manual processes, and cumbersome procedures still act as barriers to efficient trade. These inefficiencies delay shipments, raise costs, and reduce productivity. Even as countries seek to diversify trade relationships in response to tariff barriers, once again, putting that into the current context around tariffs, they often find themselves constrained by sheer complexity of border procedures. And while tariffs hit everyone, inefficient border procedures disproportionately hurt small and medium sized enterprises. These businesses typically lack the capacity to navigate multiple forms, comply with redundant inspections, or absorb long delays. Inhibiting the access to markets discourages entrepreneurship, stifles innovation, and weakens economic development. And so that's from Philippe Eisler and Mariam Soumaré from the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation. And I found this particularly relevant in the work that I do as part of the Small Business Development Center network. I see this firsthand. The companies that I'm providing international trade assistance to, yes, they are struggling with or trying to wrap their head around tariffs and how that's impacting both their ability to import components that they may need or the products that they sell directly into the US market. Another issue, though, is that even though all the attention is being placed, or most of the attention these days, on the tariffs, they are still facing those bottlenecks and those constraints when trying to import and export goods across and into other countries. So my own experience, I've kind of been talking about this as we're going, but all my over 35 years of experience in international trade, I've witnessed firsthand trade facilitation and its importance. So former U.S. Customs official, I was part of the customs team in Miami, Florida, where I worked implementing NAFTA and other free trade agreements while I was with customs. And part of that implementation meant getting information out so that companies could use that free trade agreement to their advantage. The other part of that was enforcing the requirements. So I did both of those in my career. While with customs, I did some technical assistance around the world. As a U.S. customs official, I did some work in Honduras and Venezuela. So focusing on both helping countries maximize their ability to both, we didn't use the term as much back then, facilitate, but also to enforce trade. So finding an optimal balance to make sure that risks were properly managed and enforcement was appropriate, but also that trade was facilitated, because you can have the most efficient and most effective customs administration, but if that enforcement stifles economic activity and allows or makes it difficult for companies to succeed in international trade, it's not good for the economy and economic development. And then once again, my current work with the Small Business Development Center and work around the world on different customs and trade issues. So when I was with the U.S. Customs, one of the key things, and I highlighted that, is enforcing import admissibility requirements. And there's a lot of issues around trade facilitation that go beyond tariffs and customs. So what's required to actually legally import a product into another country? So if you were looking to export from whatever country you're in to the United States, or if you're in the United States and you're looking to import, then you need to understand what the import admissibility requirements. How do you do that? Well, you need that information provided to you. You need to be able to understand what that information is and what it means in practical terms if you're trying to engage in international trade. Another thing, of course, harmonized system classification. I'm going to argue that is trade facilitation in various ways. HS classification, because it's a global harmonized system, is definitely a trade facilitation issue, because the system for that is generally considered to be harmonized. It is legally, but in practicality, it's not always. So HS classification is a harmonization issue, and all these other issues as well, but I'm going to focus on the highlighted one: public outreach, consultations, and training. So getting the information out to the companies to allow them, especially small, medium enterprises, so that they can comply. and then my assignments at the NAFTA Center in Dallas, Texas. So back in the early to mid 90s, when I was at the NAFTA Center, which was formed when the trade agreement passed to be a center for disseminating information on NAFTA and how to comply with it. That's kind of prior to the internet being as common as it is today. So the information was basically disseminated through phone calls, through some information online. There were different internet systems out there, but it was mainly done through information that we provided to companies through phone calls and visits to our center. So the whole concept of trade facilitation and getting information out was done using different technology. And pardon me, I got a pesky fly that keeps bothering me here. So they want to be in on this seminar. It's not facilitating my ability to um, to do this, but I got to keep focused. So in 1993, many sections of the Tariff Act of 1930 um, were, you could say, kind of highlighted again. And so with the NAFTA implementation, we built on legislation going back to the 1930s. And by the way, some of that legislation from the 1930s today is affecting the tariffs that we hear about in the news today. Talked about informed compliance and shared responsibility. And so I'm going to tell you exactly what the legislation that implemented NAFTA said. It said the trade community needs to be clearly and completely informed of its legal obligations. According to the MOD Act, which was that legislation that implemented NAFTA, it imposed greater obligation on customs to provide the public and improved information to the trade community, both their rights and responsibilities. So getting the information out there and expecting companies to comply. So I'm going to look at my time here. It's okay. We're doing okay. The International Convention on Simplification and Harmonization. I'm going to go into another source of trade facilitation now. This is done through the World Customs Organization, the Kyoto Convention, and then the Revised Kyoto Convention. The original Kyoto Convention goes back to 1974, if I'm not mistaken, and then the Revised Kyoto Convention. You're going to see a lot of the same concepts here: transparency, predictability, standardization, simplified procedures, maximum use of information technology, and striking the balance between trade facilitation and control. And how that's done is through risk management. So risk management, the concept of not applying the same. So we talk about harmonization and simplification, but on the other hand, not every import or export is going to be treated the same because of risk management. And to facilitate trade, you need to be able to distinguish between high and low risk shipments and apply appropriate measures to those risks. And so that is how trade can be facilitated in the customs context. And key there, I should talk more. I did mention briefly the trade facilitation committees, but the partnership with the trade community is key for trade facilitation, because the input on the issues, the bottlenecks, their concerns needs to be shared with customs, and customs needs to take that into account to be able to adjust their model to make sure that their enforcement mission is, of course, emphasized, but also their facilitation. Because more effective, I can tell you my own experience with customs and working around the world, that you do better customs enforcement when you have the ability to distinguish between what's coming in as being low or high risk, so you don't just focus superficially on everything without doing a deep dive on the things that really require it. So Chapter 5 of the DR-CAFTA agreement, which I mentioned, there is a whole, I chose different articles that I think are consistent with trade facilitation. Article 5.1, the publication, and you're going to find this, whatever country you're in, you'll find that free trade agreements, international agreements these days have a lot of trade facilitation elements built into them. So all these, in my view, are issues that are tied into trade facilitation. Advanced rulings, which is where you can go to customs and get a ruling on a technical matter, and that facilitates trade because you already know the answer, what the classification is under the harmonized system, what's the valuation, do you meet admissibility requirements, et cetera. So different issues can be subject to an advanced ruling. We call them in the US generally binding rulings, but those can definitely help facilitate trade. and capacity building as well. So I talked a lot about the Trade Facilitation Agreement as we've been going along, because, of course, a lot of people on this call are going to be living in a country that is a WTO member, but didn't happen overnight, as I think I've pointed out, and builds on a lot of other pillars, and came into effect in 2017. And I would argue these days that it's facing a lot of challenges, because not only tariffs, but as trade tensions and quote unquote trade wars build, then customs administrations are under a lot of pressure to focus and highlight their enforcement, not just their facilitation. And in some circles, some might argue that the concept of trade facilitation has even become a bad word. I don't see it that way. Even my own experience with customs, if I had a chance to talk to anybody, I would really highlight that trade facilitation can help enhance the enforcement, and enforcement can help enhance trade facilitation. It works both ways. So making sure that businesses involved in international trade are not hit with in the recent trade wars, and this information wasn't published in time, where companies had been working on orders that they were going to import for a long time, and were working because of trade facilitation. We were able to consult the harmonized tariff schedule in the United States and try to calculate very accurately what their costs would be to import those goods. However, by the time the product actually was produced and arrived, there was a whole new world, and they were facing 25% tariffs that they had not originally factored into their calculations on their landed cost. So it's more of a moving cost, moving target these days. Once again, not to go into every one of these points, but if you look at Article 1, publication, availability of information, think back to what I was mentioning earlier, how NAFTA, when NAFTA first came into effect in the early to mid 90s, we talked about the MOD Act and shared responsibility, and the fact that U.S. Customs, as it was known at the time before CBP, had to make that information available to the public and disseminate the information through whatever means and whatever technology was relevant in that place and time, because whatever technology we have today is going to change anyways. So when we say publication availability of information, we're not saying just through the internet. Whatever means of publication and availability, whatever means those are today and what they could be in the future. Also give companies the opportunity to comment on potential changes. These days, it's more of a challenge around in the United States around trade policy and tariffs, because a lot of these issues are being announced quickly, and implementation dates, and because the legal authority that are being used aren't always following this Article 2, where the companies would have pre-notice of the fact that these could go into effect, and then have an opportunity to comment through. In the United States, we have what's called the Federal Register, but other countries, you have your other legal gazette or legal instrument that allows for the publication of this information. And through the WTO TFA, companies are going to see that and have the ability to digest that, and then to get back to customs or whatever implementing agency is in charge of that, and go back with their comments. And that's why it's critical the private sector have a voice with customs, and the private sector needs to be expansive and needs to encompass a wide range of companies of all sizes, including entrepreneurs and SMEs. Advanced rulings. Once again, we saw that in other places. So you're seeing this over and over, a lot of these same concepts, the ability to appeal. So if you're not in agreement with what customs has done, and this helps companies of all sizes, you have legal channels that you can go through in order to be able to appeal that enforcement action. And a number of different mechanisms to both get information, share information, and to be heard and actually have an impact. How you do that, even in the United States right now, there are various avenues that are open, various trade organizations that are getting their opinions across. So it's not If you're in another country, the situation may seem to be one way. Here on the ground in the United States, it could be different. And if you have any doubts, just look at LinkedIn and you can see all the different posts that I read every day. I get up early, probably 3:30 or 4, to see what's going on in international trade in the U.S. and around the world. And so um, I'm going to argue that channels outside government official channels, such as LinkedIn and social media, also plays a role in trade facilitation. So not going to go through all these. You can see them, but we've been talking about them. These are articles in the WTO TFA, Section 1. Look at the time here. So I'm going to leave a little time later on for some questions. Freedom of transit, customs cooperation. You're seeing more and more of this. I know some of you may be living in APEC countries or ASEAN countries. So there are different agreements about sharing data between customs authorities, and that is meant to be able to facilitate trade as well and enhance enforcement. So when I talk about facilitation, I think one of the things that I like to emphasize from my own career, my own experience, is that, once again, I'll say it again, enforcement and facilitation go hand in hand. It has to be win-win. There's benefit for complying, and through those benefits, then the trade community is providing information to customs and the other government agencies that enforce cross-border trade to be able to more effectively manage and enforce laws and regulations. So in Section 2 of the WTO TFA, these are more at a high level, gives different countries different implementation schedules, and there's a lot of complexities around implementing trade facilitation. And I'll talk some here about my own experience. I think I've worked in about 20 countries on long and short-term customs projects. And so concepts that, and I would argue many of these concepts started in the United States and the European Union and in those areas, and were kind of new concepts in other parts of the world. And a lot of that has to do with the historical legacy around customs, what the role of customs is, and how customs actually worked. So the enforcement, oftentimes, in my experience in other countries, was not on trade facilitation compliant measures such as self-certification of meeting requirements. Rather, it was more focused on having a stamp and a signature of a particular official, which didn't enhance the enforcement abilities of those authorities, because a lot of times the end game was, I need that stamp and I need that signature in order to either export my goods or import my goods. And so the impediment and the way that that could hold up trade facilitation is that it might be very difficult to get the official that you needed to sign off on your documentation, which was usually in paper form. You might need to make an appointment, or in some cases, you might need to pay for that service, in an improper fashion, rather than using digital and electronic types of systems to transmit the information that you need. So the whole issue around approvals, pre-approvals, and certifications and things you need, obviously the move towards digital platforms, single windows that countries have, which is actually part of the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement that was on one of the earlier slides. But having a single point, a single window where traders and the government authorities can input the information that they need or access the information they need for the actual import-export transactions to take place. Those are key. So leveraging digital technologies also helps to reduce the opportunity for corruption or for favored treatment. It should be a neutral type of, besides the issue of risk management, that you can argue, how the determination is made if a transaction is high or low risk. That's another issue. But having a neutral platform where the traders can actually enter the information they need to in one single point rather than in various points is very important. And that gives the information that customs needs, because they get the information digitally, electronically, to crunch the data, analyze the data, and better target shipments for enforcement. So the complexity around that has led to, when it came to implementing the WTO TFA, allowed for developing countries to request extended periods of time necessary to be able to implement the WTO TFA. It costs a lot of money, not only to create the systems, and as I said, I've been involved in some of these projects around the world. So it costs a lot of money to acquire the technology to start up these systems, but then it also costs a lot of money and human resources to be able to manage these, update them over time. So it talked a little bit, I'm not going to get in the technical part of that, about how different categories to implement the WTO TFA. And once again, I see some reports sometimes on what countries have implemented what parts of the WTO TFA, or they're in compliance or not. And sometimes I have my own skeptical thoughts on those, because I know firsthand that some of that implementation may have been done. It might have been a check mark. Yes, it's completed, but the actual on the ground, if you want to say day-to-day utilization of trade facilitation, may have not been updated to meet the current conditions, the current laws and regulations, and the changing trade environment. And to a certain extent, I would say in the United States, people struggle, and not to a certain extent, a lot of the information has not yet been published on the exact tariffs that will be in place, and a lot of nuance and technicalities are around those tariffs, such as when's the date they'll go into effect? Is it when the ship left the port of export, etc. So right now in the United States, there are some, I would say, some issues around that, of making sure that our own adherence to these concepts is done. And I would say that it still is, even if there's more challenges. So let me show you here. So talking about the United States, and this is going to be the last part of my talk before we open up for questions. So trade facilitation is still going on in the U.S. Right now, Customs and Border Protection has its biggest annual meeting that brings together the trade community and customs officials and other regulatory agencies. And so there's an exchange going on right now about all that's going on, and companies wanted to know, going back to the concept of shared responsibility, what they need to do to comply, how they comply, and then voicing their intention to comply, but understanding what it's really going to cost them to engage in an international transaction. What is the landed cost of a product? If the tariff schedule hasn't been updated, how do you know? What other sources of information are there that companies can use to plan? So, and some of these you can look up yourselves, and you'll see I provided links here, but one thing I'm going to really recommend is U.S. Customs and Border Protection has a series of informed compliance publications. Once again, that's trade facilitation, because that puts out information on issues that Customs deems to be key areas of concern for both the trade community and for Customs. And by following those, you will get guidance on how to comply. And so when you comply and you're informed, it's probably a lower chance that your goods are going to get stuck at the border and have a delay, or you're going to get some kind of fine or penalty for non-compliance. So seek these out, these informed compliance publications. The harmonized tariff schedule course is online, and they update those as soon as something becomes official. So one thing we have to do is distinguish between, when we hear about tariffs being announced, some of these announcements are not quote unquote official until they go through a process. And later on the same slide, I talk about presidential proclamations or executive orders, as we call them, those are also published and made available almost immediately. So I would argue that trade facilitation is not dead, because even if some of this information is coming up quickly, it is still being made available for companies to be able to plan and to take them into consideration. So you have the Federal Register as well, which is our official government, if you want to say, rulemaking and rule um, publication that's done digitally. And so you can consult and see when executive order is finalized. It'll also be published there. When an actual regulation comes into effect, it's going to be published in the Federal Register. Uh, Measures that are going through the official rulemaking process. So we need to distinguish the legal authority in the United States. Usually tariffs are implemented by Congress. But what's happening right now is that the US is using legislative authority under different um, legal sources that allow for some of this to take effect immediately, such as IEPA, which is Emergency Economic Powers Act, which allows for the president to implement different measures against countries um, in order to address an emergency. It's still going to be published in these executive orders that you see here, the link to. And then advanced rulings. So I mentioned that advanced rulings can be requested on a number of issues, such as harmonized classification, valuation, free trade agreement eligibility. Those get published in a publicly available resource called the cross rulings module. So if you're curious at how a good is properly classified, and not only curious, I would say if you're importing a product, you're required to exercise reasonable care in the US. That went in with that legislation that I mentioned that implemented NAFTA. So the information is made available. So if I can find through this cross ruling a harmonized classification on a complex product, then I'm expected to exercise reasonable care as an importer and seek that information out and see that ruling. And if it applies to my situation, I'm expected to use that classification, not just say that I'm using this classification or the other classification because I think this applies. You can't ignore the ruling module. So once again, it's both a facilitation measure and it helps customs by increasing the level of compliance, and just takes away some of the discretion that could be unfairly used both by customs, and this is around the world. Many countries publish uh, the rulings, as well as the companies who want to game the system to their benefit. It's harder to do that when a ruling is out there and it's public, and you're expected to go search those rulings out to make sure that you comply. So I think I'm getting close to the end, but just to reiterate why trade facilitation is important to small, medium enterprises. Um, if you're trying to sell a good, and I would also add this to digital trade or cross-border trade, which is coming up more and more in the news again, such as whether or not there may be tariffs on digital trade. But determining what is required to import a good, but also a service or a technology. The rules need to be understood by SMEs, and they need to know how to comply and take the appropriate steps to comply. And that might cost some money to do that. So whatever target market, and I teach a class at the University of Mississippi, and I try to get my students to understand the real world and international trade. And so if you're going to export to another market, that's going to become an import into that other country. And so what is required to legally import that? When I was in US Customs, every day for those years that I worked at Customs, I saw products that were blocked or seized. And the companies involved in those, which were very often small, medium-sized companies, um, they may have lost all their investments. The exporter and the importer may have had some kind of commercial dispute over who's responsible, who's got to pay for that, et cetera. So it's really key to understand what the admissibility requirements are. And in a changing trade environment these days, it's not just about tariffs. There's a lot of focus also on non-tariff measures or non-tariff barriers. So what I refer to, and oftentimes in the customs context, is called admissibility requirements. So you need to also apply, or you need to comply with all government agency import-export requirements. For example, in the United States, we have a lot of export controls around technology. So the other country receiving this product or technology may, to put it mildly, may not be so concerned about the US export control requirements, which could be around technologies such as AI chips and advanced technologies that we deem important in the United States for national security to protect. The United States has a very strong export control part of its trade regulation or trade regulatory environment. So keep that in mind. In many countries, many developing countries I've worked in, the issue of export controls may be around making sure that food supplies are kept in the country to make sure that food is available for the population rather than controlling technologies going out. So there's a different balance and a different mix of import-export requirements, but often those are agencies that are not just customs. And so for SMEs, it's critical to understand that I work with a lot of SMEs in the United States here in the state of Mississippi that are developing technologies around the ocean or around dual use or defense or critical areas that are of national interest to the United States. And so the way that their trade is governed, often a small, medium-sized company doesn't have the money or the resources to understand those and doesn't have dedicated staff product design or manufacturing. And so resources such as the small business development centers here in the United States, we can help companies understand those and comply with them. You want to avoid delays. You don't want your shipments stuck at borders. I mean, the costs can add up really quickly, and I see that happen a lot where especially small businesses, oftentimes they're dealing with other small businesses and neither side fully understands the exporter or the importer who's going to be responsible besides using an Incoterm, which is a whole nother subject. Oftentimes the companies don't fully understand what those Incoterms really mean in practical terms. And lower the risk for fines, penalties, seizures of merchandise. So making sure that the business is sustainable and profitable, and of course calculating your landed costs, because you need to set your pricing and determine what you might need to do, what you may need to adjust as a company. As let's say tariffs go up and the US may have a tariff and another country may retaliate, just an example. So how do you calculate your total landed cost? Or freight costs may go up because of supply chain disruptions or a lack of availability on certain routes. So I think, and I'm just going to conclude and still have some minutes here for some questions. So my observations, I've seen notable improvements in trade facilitation over the years, both in the US and around the world. As I mentioned, I've probably had the good fortune on both short and long-term projects to work in around 20 countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So I've seen trade facilitation go from a concept that wasn't even really understood or, well, first it wasn't even necessarily a term that was real popular or common in US customs when I started in the 90s, even though we were facilitating trade. And the revised Kyoto Convention, the Kyoto Convention going back to 1974, were on the radar for customs. But I've seen great improvements, and that includes, I guess, an awareness of what it is and why it's important. So recent increases in tariffs and changes in US trade policy. Obviously, the United States is one of the key players globally in international trade. So there's been a lot of changes since January, and there's also what is the response of other countries. And that's not only in tariffs, that's in measures and enforcement and a lot of other areas. So it's a moving target these days. So changing national and global contexts, even in the best time, make the implementation of the WTO TFA, the trade facilitation, difficult. As I said, it's one thing to have a check mark. You had an international project, or you have donors that say, was this, or the WTO, was the trade facilitation agreement implemented in your country? Check mark, yes, but it's an ongoing process that involves processes, procedures, technologies. It's not just about one or the other. And there's a need for ongoing technical assistance, especially for developing countries and least developed countries, LDC members, to use the UN terminology. And human resources, technology expenditures for both the government and the private sector are vital. And government support, understanding, I would say that trade facilitation is not a bad word. And as I said, if I ever had a chance to talk to policymakers doubting that trade facilitation also enhances enforcement and whatever their goals and objectives are as an organization, which can change over time, and the priorities for enforcement, trade facilitation will enhance those, in my view and experience. All stakeholders, including the companies involved, must have awareness and also reasonable expectations around trade facilitation, its implementation and maintenance and impact. And I'll just finish, and I highlighted that risk management, both internally in companies. Companies need to understand the risks. Is it tariffs? Is it non-tariff measures? Is it both? It's not the same now as it was in November, et cetera. So using risk management, but also on the government side. So government agencies that enforce trade need to strike an optimal balance between facilitation and enforcement. Take into account the economic impact on the companies, and the companies involved in trade need to take into account how their activities impact what customs and other government agencies are doing. And I think that's it. So thank you.
All right. Thank you for that very interesting and informative topic. So before we proceed with the Q&A, I just want to take a moment to introduce you, Adam FTD, a powerful platform designed to help businesses and individuals streamline their workflow and enhance productivity. So whether you're looking for advanced data management solutions, seamless integration, or innovative digital tools, Adam FTD have you covered. So to learn more, visit adamftd.com and discover how it can transform the way you work. So we only have a few minutes left. I'll just read the. You can stop sharing the screen now, Anthony, and then I'll show the question right now. We'll
Did I
just answer the
stop?
two questions. Yep, perfect.
Okay.
So here you go. The first question is: early in was GATT, then came WTO based on theory of comparative cost theory. Now, what would be the impact of Donald Trump tariff policy impacting the world trade?
Well, I'm going to talk about this through the lens of trade facilitation, which was my topic. So, if you don't mind, and I'm not an economist myself, but on the practical side, tied into trade facilitation. So, I kind of touched on that in my presentation, is how trade facilitation requires usually the publication of information on new requirements before they go into effect, and gives companies time to even respond to those with opinions on how it's going to affect them, but also time to plan and to react to them. So uh, one thing I can say is that definitely, so speaking as a practitioner here, not as an economist, that the tariffs make it more difficult, even as I argued that we still have trade facilitation available, and we have technologies and other um, means to get information out. Understanding how these are really going to impact their businesses is difficult, and actually calculating the cost is difficult. So if you talk about
Okay.
comparative advantage, I would say that how you're calculating that, or how you're determining that, also is necessarily going to mean you need to understand what your total landed cost really is, and
Okay.
can you do that in this current environment. So I hope that answer makes sense. So it's more difficult. I would argue that even I'm not an economist needs to understand all these implications to say um, part of that comparative advantage would be understanding costs, right? And so can we understand costs real accurately right now?
All right. With only 6 minutes left, let's answer this question. What challenges do small and medium-sized enterprise typically encounter when importing goods into the United States and exporting goods from the United States?
So one of the main things I see in my day-to-day work is most of the small, medium-sized companies don't have staff dedicated to international trade, and oftentimes it's an owner who's very focused on the business side, which of course international trade is a business side, but getting their attention to understand why this is important. So I mentioned the reasonable care on the importing, understanding that they're legally responsible to comply, but why that's important, and that this is not clerical work, that this is crucial for the well-being of their company. And um, so number one, the lack of resources to be able to have specialized staff. That's why it's key to have programs like the one I work for available to them, but also to get their attention that this is not quote unquote filling out paperwork, or it's not about clerical work, that it's a key, critical, strategic part of their business.
All right, thank you. For those who have still questions, please feel free to reach out to him. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to answer some questions. We would like to have Anthony's final insight about the topic. Any final remarks before we end the webinar, Anthony?
No, I'll just say, so it's funny, Ron. You and I got on earlier, and we were working to make sure all the technology works. And there's always any kind of presentation you do. There's always a technological issue. So technology, we finally got it to work properly. And then I had a little visitor here, so an
Mhm.
unexpected friendly fly flying around, and so hopefully I stayed focused. But I enjoy myself going with the flow when it comes. You always have to, and so I'd say the same thing for international trade. There's a lot of buzz going around you, whether it's tariffs, whether it's compliance, and in order to be successful, you need to stay focused and understand what's crucial, what's critical, and make sure that you keep your eye on your goals. And that's probably to be a sustainable, successful business, right? And make money, hopefully have some fun while you're doing this. I personally enjoy working in international trade, and I'm always happy that every day I get to work in this field. So enjoy what you're doing. Stay informed. Use LinkedIn. There's a lot of good information out there, and it's a key source to see what is happening in other countries as well, because international trade does not exist in a vacuum. And so, even though I'm in the United States and in a big country, a big economy, I know that what's going on in other countries affects the companies that I'm assisting here, or if I was an SME in trade, um, nothing happens in a vacuum. I need to be aware of what's going on around the world. What are the trends? How are people seeing U.S. products and services these days? What
Yeah.
challenges do we have to make sure that we can help our exporters enter into other markets besides all the buzz and the chatter going on? We want to make sure our companies ultimately succeed. So I think that's
Thank
probably
you.
my end there.
Thank you, Anthony. There are several questions in the chat box. I'll send you the questions and I'll also send you their contact information. So maybe you can do answer the questions offline. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your time. I
So
really
that
appreciate it.
You're welcome. That brings us to the end of our session. A huge thank you to Anthony Cambas for sharing their expertise and to all of you for attending and engaging with us today. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to connect with us. Also, you can connect to the speaker directly after the session. Thank you again, and we hope to see you in our future events. Have a great
Thank you,
day,
everyone.
everyone.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you.